All right, welcome everybody. I'm Alan Gregory. I'm the head coach for Spectrum 3847 here in Houston, Texas. With me today we have...
Hi everyone, I'm Daniel. I'm one of the drivers for the team.
In 2013, which is that left video that you see, that's the 254 robot climbing up on the inside of that pyramid where they had to go from bar to bar. We had a similar challenge to that in 2020 and 2021. 2022, the 2022 game where we had to go across the different bars. And then one season we had 20 competition the team pretty understand useful.
Sure, okay. So some of the basics for climbers. So often there's 3 different levels for climbers, but we usually encourage to make the robot simpler to only focus on the first 2 levels of the climbing. You should know how the climbs are scored and ensure your robot climbs high enough for the referees to be able to judge it as like climbed and that it's above the ground so that they can see it. And we should always have a way for the robot to not fall off when the match ends. This usually helps if we build a test setup. So in some sort of area that we have, some sort of mechanism that can like show the actual practice of it.
Yeah, so I think the main point with the basics is just making sure that when you're designing your robot that it's actually going to meet the rules of the climb. That's one of the biggest things we see teams when they're designing these endgame mechanisms and they have to design these climbers. They put all this effort in over 6 weeks and they get just like a little detail wrong, and then if the robot has to actually hang, it has to be above 12 inches off the platform, and they didn't account for like how the robot might angle a little bit or might like not quite climb right in real life. Now every time they climb, they're just a little bit short of where it has to be off the ground. And so that ends up messing up their season, and they have to rework a bunch of things because they didn't quite either get it right on the design side because they didn't think about it before, or they didn't get it right on the testing side because they weren't able to test it and actually make sure that it was going to do it correctly on the real field. Because you can design the best mechanism in the world, but if it only climbs your robot 11 inches off the ground and you have to be 12, you're not going to get the points, and it makes your season a lot harder. Similarly, it really depends on the aspects of the game and the points and everything, but on any sort of multi-level climbs, a lot of times, especially if there's only one robot that can do the big climb, like sometimes there's only room for a single robot on the Alliance to do the level 3 climb or whatever it is. If your robot can just do the level 1 or level 2 and you can do it super consistently, that might be a better option than just banking on always doing that level 3 climb when there might be other robots in your Alliance that need to do it. If you spend your time making sure your robot can do the rest of the game, that's sometimes useful. So there's some games where basically only one robot on the Alliance has to climb. 2018 was a good example of this. There was a pull-up bar, but really only one robot was doing it very often. And then there's other games where every single robot on the Alliance needs to climb. 2017 was like that in the rope climb game. 2020 was like that, where you had to have every robot on the bars for you to pretty much win your matches or to win an event. There are a lot of different suppliers now that have kits that you can buy to help get you started. They're not going to solve the entire problem, but they do make it a lot easier for you to get part of the problem solved. So a lot of the times it ends up being, how do you actually extend and retract a hook or something to be able to grab the bar? And so there's a variety of ones from Andy Mark, West Coast Products, and the Thrifty Bot that all have options now for building those telescoping or elevator designs that let you pretty easily get something that can move in and out. And then your team still has to figure out how exactly do you mount everything? How do you package it? Maybe it has to fold in and out of the robot. There's all sorts of things that still might have to get designed, but at least that one really hard part of it, like moving in and out without jamming, without breaking, all of those things that can happen just in that sort of linear mechanism system that you have to build. You can do that as a kit, and even if you don't buy the kits, because I know it's sometimes hard, especially for international teams, to actually get things shipped, all of them have their like CAD available, so you can look at these designs, see how they're built, and then base yours off of them. Then you can make custom parts for it if you need to. You can 3D print things, CNC route, whatever capabilities your team has, using these like COTS components as a nice guide to building these linear mechanisms is a really good first step for a lot of climbers. They're just a really good, solid options. They've worked for a lot of teams over multiple years now. And so you can see exactly how they work, reverse engineer them if you need to. If you do just want to buy them, that works too. And then you can go and build your robot from there. And so that's a lot easier than it was even 4 or 5 years ago when most of these things didn't exist. You were trying to just like look at CADs from other robots or trying to completely engineer the solution on your own. It was a lot harder when you didn't have these starting points that exist now. The other nice part about having commercial available products for climbers is you have gearboxes that you can use that are super simple now, that are strong enough to be able to be used as your climber gearboxes. A lot of times in pretty recent past, 5 or 6 years ago, for the most part, you were going to have to build a custom gearbox if you wanted to be able to lift the entire robot weight, or maybe combine multiple gearboxes together. Now with things like the Rev Max Planetary, they're strong enough, they can get a full Neo motor at 125 to 1, where you have a lot of reduction so that output shaft can turn really slowly if you need it to, depending on how your climber is designed. And you can winch in your entire robot's weight without having to spend a lot of time building a custom gearbox if you don't have those capabilities. If you do, you definitely can. A lot of teams will still do it, but it's just another one of those pieces where you can have something that you know works, you can plug it in, and then you can go about doing the rest of the design work to make sure that your cable's not getting tangled, to make sure it's actually not going to bend anything when you're building your structure. All of those things that can happen with the climber. Having those simple COTS parts, a good strong gearbox, and some form of power transfer system. Here I have some of the cord that's often used in climbers. It's called Dyneema, and it's a very strong plastic rope that won't stretch, which is one of the biggest things for it. If you use just normal, like if you just go buy a rope from a store, a lot of times over time, it's going to get a lot longer when you have that full robot weight hanging from that rope. Where the nice thing about this is it can be very thin, is very, very strong, it won't stretch, and it won't break on you very often. As long as it's run cleanly, it's not run over any sharp edges or anything. You can get it from a variety of sources and suppliers now. Most of the FRC sources have it. It's also sold for like sailboats and things if you're doing, if you have a sailing store or anything like that if you're near the water. You can normally get some type of cord that's similar to this, and it's very, very strong, and you can use it for climbing even down to even thinner diameters. You can climb on some pretty thin cord and still support the whole weight of the robot, which makes it a little bit easier and avoid tangling or anything like that. We talked about kind of the climber mechanisms, and we talked about the gearbox and the rope. The other piece that I think people sometimes try to over-engineer a little bit into their climbers is their motor selection. So they'll try to package them a little bit smaller, so they'll try to almost get a little over-engineered, where they think too hard about trying to make the climber have less weight or fit into a smaller package, and they'll try to use a smaller motor or less gearbox reduction or anything. And the vast majority of the time, if you don't do a lot of the math and engineering to get that exactly right, you're setting your team up for it to fail at some point when you don't want it to. So trying to climb with any of like the brushed motors, even just like a mini sim or a sim, or even like the 775 Pro motors or any of those smaller motors, even the Neo 550s, even though they're brushless, it's a lot harder some of those times to have them produce enough torque and enough force to really lift the entire robot. So it's much, much easier if teams will use one of the full-size brushless motors. Right now, those are the Rev Neo or the CTRE Falcon. Either one of those works great for climbers, depending on the design and exactly what you're trying to do. Sometimes you need one or two. But for the most part, a climber can be built with a single motor that can lift your whole robot now, which is a big advantage over what we used to have to do, where you were trying to figure out how to gang multiple robots together and combine them into one gearbox, which is really tricky to do and get right, especially for a lot of young teams. Trying to basically make the robot and the whole system more complex doesn't actually get you an advantage. So even if you see some of like the really top teams doing it, or you see some old robot CAD where they were doing that, most teams now are moving to try to get to simpler setups. You can have one or two motors, depending if you need like on one on each side, that can raise the entire robot in just a few seconds. It's normally always fast enough for the end game. And you can get a very good, efficient climber out of that. That is not too expensive. It doesn't have to be, there's less points that could possibly fail, where you've had motors unconnected or anything. We've had climbers in the past where we had a 4-motor climber that was designed in a way that even if a single motor went out, it didn't have enough force anymore to be able to lift the whole robot. And so that was a problem because we would have like a single motor just get connected or something, and then it couldn't work that way. So if you have just a good, solid, reliable connection on one of these brushless motors now, you can get a lot more consistent and reliable climb, because it's almost always better to be reliable, that you're going to climb every match, instead of being fast. So trying to like over-optimize on speed or on any other like little tiny aspect of it, instead of just reliability and just making sure you can do it every single match over and over again, that it doesn't ever fail. So you can test it constantly, make sure all of your wiring is super reliable, zip tied down, taped down. It's all in a way that it's not going to disconnect in the middle of the match. It's not going to get cut by anything. All of those things are super important in making sure your robot's going to be reliable, so that when you get to your event, people can trust you to be able to pick you to be on their alliance, because they know, yeah, this robot has the ability to climb every match, and we can draft them to do that, and we're confident they're going to do it over and over and over again. And there's some games where that may be all you have to do, where if you go in and you just really want to climb, there's some games where the climber task, if you do it right and you execute it, that can get you picked even at some of the higher levels of play. One of our examples, we had a team at our state championship. So we're in Texas where we have the district system. So we have a state championship. And the 2022 game, we only really needed 2 of our alliance members to be picking up the balls and launching them into the goal. Where our third, we were able to draft a team that all they did was climb, basically. They played a little bit of defense for about a minute or a minute and a half of the match. And they went back to the climbing area and just did the level 3 climb very consistently. And so we wanted to just make sure our third robot could bank those points, make sure they were up and consistently climbed, while our 2 other robots could go out, score, and then climb late at the end when we needed to. And that got us all the way to the state finals. And that team really couldn't do much with the balls at all. They put their whole season into just getting that climber mechanism working. And that happened to work out really well for them. There's other people that year who did the opposite, where they decided to not go to level 3. They focused a lot on making sure their robot could play with the balls, and then all they did was a very fast level 2 climb, and that also worked out well for them. So there's multiple different paths you can go. But as long as you can be consistent with whatever one you choose, you can be very reliable and have a very good season that you can feel very proud of. Okay. This is the 2016 climb. And so this was that game that had a castle tower. The robots had to throw boulders into the goals at the top windows. And then they had to climb at the end onto the rungs that were around those 3 faces. At the surface level, when we saw this game on kickoff, so I was a coach when we played this game, We definitely thought this was a relatively easy task. It looks like a task that we had done before, where it's just like, oh, you just grab onto the bar, winch yourself up. Not a big problem at all. But when you look at it a little bit deeper and you start trying to play with the geometry, either in a computer modeling program, or if you can start building prototypes, or if you build the filled elements, it's quickly, you're able to see that there are hidden challenges inside this game that make it a little bit more difficult than just doing a pull-up like we're used to in some of the more recent games. So if you helped build a robot for the 2022 game or the 2020 and 2021 games, where you were able to just like fully drive under the bar and pull and have your robot do a chin-up, this game didn't quite allow that because you couldn't drive all the way under the bar. So because the rung was just like mounted right here on this wall, and your robot had to drive up to it, you couldn't quite reach it as easily as you could with any of those games where you were just able to fully drive under it. So you have your bumpers here that run into the wall down here, and then you also have this very deceptive slope here that you drive up onto. So as you drive up onto that ramp, your whole robot's going to tilt away from the wall. And so now if you just have a climber sitting here, you try to extend up and out once you're on this platform, you're actually extending straight away from the rung. And so it makes it a lot harder to grab onto if your elevator is just going straight up, and you can't just repurpose a climb that you might have seen in like 2020 this game, because it'll have no way to actually grab onto the rung because you can't just drive under. And so that was a really small detail that it took a little while for a lot of teams to catch on to when we started designing their robots for this game. And this ended up meaning that the climbs for this game, and a lot of the climbers, and we'll see some examples here shortly, are a lot different because of this kind of like hidden challenge within this game that's a little bit harder than some of the other climb tasks we've had in the past. I'll talk about that first point.
Sure. So when you go under the low bar defense and also reaching up to the rung to the climb, you get away.
Yeah, so I didn't leave enough points. Okay, so I should have drawn a graphic for this, so I apologize for that. So the low rung defense means your whole robot has to like fold down under a really small, really small height, right? Yeah. So if you guys have already started looking at this game, I believe it's like 16 inches or something like that, if I remember correctly from a long time ago. It's very, very short. And so to be able to have your whole robot collapse into that level and then basically extend that much larger height, 6'4" height, and be able to grab that rung is also a really hard task. So that was one of the things that was sort of designed in, and it really wasn't hidden. That was pretty obvious when we kind of saw it on kickoff, was okay, if our robot has to go under this bar, it's going to be a lot harder to reach up that high instead of being able to start at whatever your max starting height is. So there were a lot of different teams that designed the robots in different ways to be able to fold down and still go under the low bar. And then some of the other teams did something that was pretty smart, which is they just decided to not go under the low bar. So if you just choose to not go under that defense at all and skip it, build your robot at the full starting height limit, make sure it can do all of the other defenses well, then still climb, you end up being pretty good on points because the other teams on your alliance can then still do the low bar. They can use that area. You can focus on some of the other parts of the game and have a really good climber at the end. And so that was one of the kind of the harder challenges that teams could accept or not. They could decide whether they wanted to be a low bar bot and just go under and then not climb, or if they wanted to do the really hard challenge of being able to go under the low bar while still figuring out how to unfold, somehow extend out from that really small profile and reach up and get to the rung. The other sort of hidden challenge with this game that didn't come out until like a lot of teams missed and ended up causing some issues a little bit throughout the game. Or how do you actually fit all 3 robots onto the sides of the castle right here? So because of how big the robots were, and because they all have bumpers on and things, if all of them just try to drive on, grab the rungs, and pull themselves up, they'd often run into each other. And so there were some teams who figured out ways to either climb really, really high, so maybe they get their whole bumpers up really close to the rung, so then teams could climb up basically like under them. So the only problem with that is you'd have to almost go first, so you'd have to be up here first, and the other teams would be able to climb with you. And there were some other teams who managed to figure out how to fold their robots a little bit more, so instead of like climbing straight up and their bumpers staying in contact with the wall, they figured out a way to like push their bumpers away from the wall, leaving more room for their partners to climb up next to them. So there's a lot of little tricks you can do, or like different design elements you can do into your robots to get to make it more compatible with your alliance. Depending on, no matter what the game is, thinking about how your robot's going to be able to climb while also thinking about how your 2 partners are going to climb at the same time can help give you a better season. So this is why in even this past year when we were just driving up on the ramp, a lot of teams built their robots to be rather narrow, so there'd be enough room on the actual charge station for every team to drive on. There's a lot, similarly in the 2020 game where we had to do a pull-up, you want to make sure your robot was relatively narrow so there's enough room for all 3 robots to hook on and climb. Anytime you have to climb next to another partner or anything like that, you have to think about how you're going to interact with them. What exactly does it going to look like when you have 2 robots drive on, grab whatever the bar is, and then climb up? How are they going to do that together? How do you coordinate that? Do you have to go first? Do you want to come in and be able to be the last one climbed? All of those can kind of change the design of your robot a little bit, depending on how you're planning to work with your partners to get multiple robots climbed on whatever the climbing element is that year. Okay, so the sort of fundamental basic task of the 2016 climb, pretty much every team had to do in some way, is figure out how to just extend a hook up out of your robot and get it onto the bar so it's fully over it and secured. And then how do you get the robot actually pulled up after that once the hook's on? So there are some teams who are able to have the elevator or telescoping climbers like we saw earlier that are kind of like sold as kits. They built their own versions of that. The kits didn't exist back then when we actually played the 2016 game. And so you either telescoped out and had like a rigid assembly that went up and grabbed the bar, and then you could pull your robot up. The other way that some teams did it was you had a relatively light assembly that would just fold up, get a hook over the bar, then it could almost attach, and you could just be on a string, so that hook was just on a cord or a string that was winched up, and your robot would winch up. Or there's some other way to get a hook over the bar, and then you could just winch up. So you didn't necessarily have to build a super rigid climbing structure if you were okay with just having your robot winched up on a cable. And so those were kind of like the 2 main methods of being able to do this climb. Depending on the implementation, each one of them could work pretty well. We're mostly going to talk about the first one with the 3 examples we have for teams who have done this, of just some way to get the hooks over the bar and then have a way to retract it all back in and do that pull-up. Okay. The first example team is sort of one of the most standard ones for this game in terms of being a very high-level robot, but had a relatively simple and easy to understand mechanism for doing it. 2056 OP Robotics this year, they were the world finalists, so they were 2nd place in the world. And they didn't do much more than just having these 2 telescoping arms. So these have the hooks on the end up here, and they fold completely down into their robots. They're able to drive under the low bar, and they have gas springs like you have sometimes on like the trunk of a car that flip up the arms when they're released, and they're able to pivot out the back. They extend up, they drive them over this bar, they retract them back down, and their robot climbs up. There's not anything really complicated to it in terms of the concept. It's very easy to understand exactly how these 2 arms are going to work. They telescope in and out just like any of those cot kits. So if you're not sure exactly how to build like one of those telescoping arms, again, looking at the videos and the CAD and the assembly manuals for any of those COTS telescoping kits is a really good way to start understanding how that telescoping assembly works, how you can extend something out and then retract it back down. And this worked really, really well for them, since it's just simple aluminum tubes, one inside the other of different sizes, with some springs that can extend it out and a rope that pulls the whole robot back down on some sort of like winch drum assembly powered by a motor. So there's not a whole lot going on, but it was a very reliable and consistent climbing structure that they were able to build and test and execute and get it to work very, very reliably without anything super uncommon, right? So they didn't do anything to kind of move their bumpers out of the way. If another robot was trying to climb up on their side, they'd probably run into them here. That was good enough for what they needed to do. It ended up being like you didn't have 3 robots trying to climb very often in this game. So they ended up not really needing to do anything more than just this basic level of a climb. Again, they were world finalists. They were one of the best robots in the world that year without having to really do any like tricks or anything super clever to get their robot up on the bar and just complete this game challenge. Another team that was very good this year in 2016 was 33, the Killer Bees. They've been around for a very long time. Their number's really low. So they've built a lot of climbers over the years. This is one of their better ones because it was able to kind of package and stay out of the way of the rest of the robot very nicely. It's a little hard to see in this picture completely, but it's very similar to what OP does in that it has 2 telescoping arms. But instead of having like 2 individual hooks and their arms are disconnected, they actually connect all the way across the bar. They thought a little bit outside of the box. And instead of just having a hook that went over the single bar and kind of grab it like your hands would when you're doing a pull-up, they had their robot grab all the way around the entire rung structure, that whole like U shape where it has the 2 bars coming off the wall and then connecting. So they grabbed around the entire thing. And so they were very, very secure without having to have any sort of hook mechanism. They were just able to slot in right behind the bar. This whole thing folded down very similar to 2056 robot. They were able to flip it up, extend it out very quickly, and pull it back down and get that robot up off the ground above the height it had to be accounted as climbed. Again, this was very, very consistent. They had springs to extend those telescoping tubes in and out, had a motor to winch it back down, and that sort of concept for a lot of the climbers is the recipe to kind of make a lot of climbers work is if you don't need a lot of force to push the mechanism out, you can use springs for it, and then you can just spool back in a cord to do yourself and give yourself that pull-up. And then the last one is a little bit more complicated because they were kind of making sure that their robot fit that harder challenge. The 148 robot, and this is also similar to the 1114 robot, they sort of shared some design decisions that year. And so they had a much more unique climb where instead of just doing that sort of telescoping or elevator climb where they're going to retract and extend something, they had their arms fully fold out. And so these are folded in once here, and then these get folded down again. And they fold all the way out to be able to grab onto the bar. And then the strap or the rope is attached up here, and the whole robot sort of rotates up onto the bar. And so the big advantage with this design, and the reason why they went with it, was that they were able to completely have their bumpers removed from the wall. So if they're out here in the middle and they get fully climbed up, their partners can be on either side of them. And if 33 is over here and 2056 is on this side, they can both be climbed without running into this robot here in the middle. And so that was why they did this advantage. It worked well for them, but also the teams who didn't do it were also fine. So a lot of times those little things are useful, but they don't have to make or break your season. So even if you know it's a thing, and you're like, ooh, it'd be really cool if our climber did this, if you're not sure about your team's resources, is oftentimes better just to build the thing you know you can get done and you know can be reliable, so that you can do it every single match instead of trying to push that little extra feature or that little bit more if you're not quite capable of doing it. Okay, so those are the 3 examples we have from this year, and we have time for questions about any of concepts of how climbers work or any specific details people want to go into.
So we are going to make some questions to you. We have 2 separate questions, and I'm going to ask you and wait the chat make their own questions. So the first question that I have is, what method you suggest to make a climber prototype?
So prototyping climbers is kind of interesting. It really depends on exactly what your the challenge is, like how the game is going to work. And for any prototype, so this is intakes, launchers, any prototype you're going to build for your robot, your question shouldn't be, how do I build a prototype for this? It should be, what do we still need to know? And what are we trying to learn from this prototype? Because if your climber is very simple, if it's just going to be an elevator that's going to pick your robot up and down, you kind of can know without building a prototype how to build an elevator. We've had a lot of examples. Maybe you have built an elevator concept in the fall that you want to make sure if you didn't know how an elevator works, you haven't built one. Building a full one is great, but a lot of teams will try to prototype just because they think they have to. But if you're prototyping and you're just putting some 2x4s together and they slide, they're not going to really teach you anything about a certain concept. So a lot of times you can either climber in CAD and either get some of the geometry out that you need to prototype. You're like, ooh, I don't know if this is going to reach exactly or how it's going to interact with the bar. So maybe you build a prototype that just does that. Maybe it doesn't extend at all. It doesn't do any of the climb, but it like fits all the geometry you've sketched out. And it's the right size, so you can see if it's going to work. In the past, we've built scale models to help with some of the climber geometry where we weren't quite sure how things were going to work. We did this a lot in our 2022 game where there were like the monkey bars you had to climb across. We built I want to say it was like a 1/7 or 1/8 scale model of that whole climber assembly. And then we could just like cut out little or 3D print little bits of it. And we could see exactly if it was going to reach where we wanted it to, or like what the order of operations were going to have to be to make the climb work. So there's sometimes you can build a scale model that makes you iterate really fast. Because the problem with a lot of people, if you get down this path of prototyping climbers, because they're such a large thing, and you need to also make sure they can actually hold all the weight of the robot, you're trying to build a prototype version of it, you pretty much get close to building the real thing if you go down the path too far. So it's better a lot of times just to make sure you get the details right, test or prototype the bits that you're really not sure about, and figure out what you need to learn. Try to learn those things in whatever the simplest, fastest, cheapest way you can is, and then start designing and building a version of the real one. Then make sure you can just test and iterate on that concept first. So that was one of the things we did in 2022 as well, was we basically put together a little test chassis, and we're able to start building a version of our climber on something that didn't have wheels, didn't have anything, it just was a weighted down chassis. We could build like a whole test version of it once we kind of knew some of the other concepts, after we had done some of the scale models and things. But a lot of times if it's just an elevator and you know it's just going to be an elevator, you're better off just building that thing really quickly than working on the real one and trying to make some sort of 2x4 wooden slide thing that's not going to work very well.
Okay, thank you. The other question we have is, would you recommend the teams to make the system very robust and easy to maintain? What strategies the teams can use?
Yes. That's probably one of the biggest things for every robot is you're better off making it robust and being able to do maintenance on it, even if that means sacrificing features because your team doesn't have quite enough resources to do everything and keep it reliable. So the strategies for that for climbers are very similar to what it's going to be for the rest of the robot. And the number one thing I think teams don't quite do all the time, or the one that they make that you have misses on for maintenance, is just thinking about maintenance and reliability when you're doing your initial design. A lot of times when we're building stuff and then we're doing design review, one of the things I'll bring up with the students a lot is, okay, you built this here and we can build this, but what happens when this part breaks? How many things do we have to take apart to be able to fix it? How do we get tools in there? What kind of like spare do we need to have ready to be able to mount to it or to be able to repair something? Then also, as you're testing, one of the biggest things for every team is they get better at doing FRC. The quicker you can get things built, so that the more time you have to test at your home before you actually go to the event, more like you're able to be to find where it's going to mess up and actually make fixes and design changes to make it reliable at the event. So all of the teams that you see, if you're just seeing videos and you're like, oh, that robot's so amazing, it's amazing by the time it got to the field. The first time they tested it at their shop, it was not amazing. They never are. They're interesting and cool, but they always have little things that don't quite work the way they thought they were going to work when they did the design for them. Something might have got manufactured slightly wrong. Something might have messed up a little bit, or just as it went up and was doing the climb, or gets hit the wrong way. And then they go through and they make little tweaks and they iterate on it over and over again in their shop before it ever gets seen by the public, before it's ever on the field. They make all of those changes, and that makes it reliable. Similarly, they make changes throughout the entire season. So if you're able to go to multiple events, that's one of the best ways to get your robot more reliable, because after you have your first event, or first practice session even sometimes, if you can go somewhere and get a little bit more practice with other robots, you can figure out what breaks, then design in those changes so that you hopefully don't have that same thing break again. And that's one of the things we try really hard to do in season. We don't always get it right, but we try very hard not to have the same thing break twice. Once we've seen it break in some way, we try to actually design in the repair, not just a one-for-one replacement that we know is going to break the same way again. Try to get something fully designed where it will be able to fix that problem, and then maybe it'll break it a different new way, but ideally it's not the same way that we already know about.
So that's the questions that I have. The chat didn't say anything, so I want to thank you for take your time to be here with us. It was very, very good. I learned a lot. And I think the chat will use the knowledge you passed them on the challenge. So, thank you so much. E para todos aqueles que viram, ou aqueles que não viram, a gente vai legendar e dublar toda a aula de hoje. Entre hoje e amanhã, talvez no início da tarde saia, essa aula vai estar disponível aqui no Discord. Então, thank you so much and see you on the next season.
Thank you all. I hope you have a great event.